The first crack of thunder rolled across the sky as Mike Davidson stood in his backyard, hands on his hips, surveying the above-ground pool that had been the center of so many family memories. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the worn vinyl liner and rusted metal frame. A once-cherished summer oasis now transformed into a maintenance nightmare and potential hazard. The forecast called for severe storms all week, and Mike knew it was time. 12 summers, he muttered to himself, remembering the day he'd installed it. His kids had been young then, their excited squeals echoing through the neighborhood as they splashed around on hot July afternoons. But they were teenagers now, more interested in friends and phones than backyard swimming. The pool had sat largely unused for the past 2 seasons, requiring constant upkeep while delivering diminishing returns. As a practical man who worked as a contractor, Mike didn't believe in holding on to things that had outlived their usefulness. The decision hadn't come lightly. He'd discussed it with his wife Sarah and their children over dinner the previous night. Though tinged with nostalgia, the family had agreed it was time to reclaim their backyard space. What Mike couldn't have anticipated was that his perfectly reasonable decision about his own property would ignite a neighborhood war. The following Saturday dawned bright and clear, ideal weather for the pool demolition. Mike had enlisted his brother-in-law Dave and 2 friends from work to help with the project. They arrived early, armed with tools and fueled by the promise of pizza and beer once the job was done. "You sure about this, Mike?" Dave asked, coffee mug in hand, as they stood contemplating the task ahead. "Seems like a shame." "Structure's compromised in a few spots," Mike explained, pointing to where the metal frame had begun to buckle. "And we're paying to maintain something nobody uses anymore. Besides, Sarah wants to put in a vegetable garden." The man had just begun draining the pool when Mike noticed a figure approaching from the house next door. Veronica Winters, or V, as she preferred to be called, was a relative newcomer to the neighborhood, having moved in about 8 months ago. In that short time, she'd managed to lodge formal complaints about everything from garbage can placement to the color of holiday decorations. "Excuse me," she called, her voice carrying the artificial sweetness that Mike had come to recognize as a warning sign. "What exactly is happening here?" Mike straightened up and offered a neighborly smile. "Morning, V. We're taking down the old pool. It's seen better days." Veronica's expression shifted from curiosity to outrage so quickly that Mike almost missed the transition. "You can't do that," she stated flatly. "Excuse me." "You can't take down that pool," she repeated, crossing her arms. "My children love looking at it from our upstairs windows. It adds value to the whole neighborhood." Mike blinked, momentarily speechless. As far as he knew, Veronica's children had never once asked to use the pool, nor had she ever mentioned their apparent attachment to viewing it from afar. "Well, I'm sorry to hear that," he said carefully, "but it's getting dangerous, and it's on our property. We've made our decision." Veronica's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that," she replied, pulling out her phone as she stalked back toward her house. Dave whistled low. "Think she's just blowing off steam?" Mike shrugged and picked up his tools again. "Probably. What's she going to do, call the cops because I'm removing my own pool?" Little did he know, that was exactly what Veronica Winters intended to do. Mike and his crew had made significant progress by midday. The water had been safely drained into the storm sewer as permitted by local regulations, and they were beginning to dismantle the metal frame when the unmistakable sound of sirens grew louder, eventually stopping in front of Mike's house. "You've got to be kidding me," Dave muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead as a police cruiser pulled into the driveway. Mike set down his wrench and walked toward the front yard, bewilderment etched across his face. A young officer, couldn't be more than 30, Mike guessed, stepped out of the vehicle looking slightly uncomfortable. "Afternoon, sir. Officer Reyes," the policeman introduced himself. "We received a call about some potential property damage happening at this address." Mike couldn't help but laugh. "Property damage? Officer, I'm dismantling my own pool that's been in my backyard for 12 years. Officer Reyes nodded, seeming to assess the situation. "Mind if I take a look?" "Be my guest," Mike replied, leading him around to the backyard where the half-dismantled pool stood as evidence of the morning's labor. The officer surveyed the scene before turning back to Mike. "Do you have proof of ownership?" The caller was quite insistent that this was some kind of neighborhood amenity. "Neighborhood amenity?" Mike echoed incredulously. He gestured toward Veronica's house, where he could see her watching from an upstairs window. "My neighbor moved in less than a year ago. That pool has been exclusively on my property and maintained at my expense since my kids were in elementary school." Mike's wife, Sarah, emerged from the house, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. Sensing the tension, she approached with a concerned expression. "Is there a problem?" she asked, looking between her husband and the officer. "Mrs. Davidson, I'm Officer Reyes. There's been a complaint about the pool removal." Sarah's eyebrows shot up. "A complaint? From whom?" As if on cue, Veronica appeared at the edge of their property, arms folded tightly across her chest. She was accompanied by a man Mike recognized as Douglas Peterman, the president of their neighborhood association. "That pool is part of what makes this neighborhood desirable," Veronica announced loudly. "The Davidsons have no right to remove a feature that affects all of our property values." Sarah stepped forward, her usual diplomatic demeanor strained. "Veronica, we've maintained that pool for over a decade. It's structurally compromised and a potential safety hazard." "Then fix it," Veronica snapped. "Don't remove it." Douglas cleared his throat. "Mike, Sarah, perhaps we could discuss this at the next association meeting? Community features are something we all have a stake in." Mike felt his patience evaporating like the last puddles of pool water beneath the afternoon sun. "Doug, this isn't a community feature. It's a private pool on private property that my family paid for and maintained. There's nothing in the HOA agreement about pools being communal property." Officer Reyes, clearly recognizing the dispute for what it was, sighed. "Sir, do you have the deed to your property or any documentation showing the pool installation?" "Of course I do," Mike replied, frustration evident in his voice. "The pool was professionally installed. I have all the permits and paperwork in my home office." While Sarah went inside to retrieve the documents, Veronica stepped closer to the officer. "Officer, they're deliberately destroying something that benefits everyone. My children specifically chose their bedroom because of the view of that pool. It's practically false advertising for them to remove it now." Dave and the other workers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating situation but unsure whether to continue working. Sarah returned with a folder containing their property deed, the original pool installation permit from 12 years ago, and photos documenting the pool's deteriorating condition. "As you can see," she explained to Officer Reyes, "not only is this unquestionably our property, but the pool has become a liability. The metal supports are corroding and the liner has multiple tears. We've made repairs for years, but it's reached the end of its lifespan." Officer Reyes reviewed the documents and nodded. "Everything seems in order here. Mr. and Mrs. Davidson, you're within your rights to remove structures on your own property." He turned to Veronica and Douglas. "I understand your concerns about neighborhood aesthetics, but this is clearly a private structure on private property." Veronica's face flushed crimson. "This isn't over," she declared, pulling out her phone again and storming away. Douglas, looking somewhat embarrassed, offered an awkward apology before following her. As Officer Reyes prepared to leave, he paused. "Just a heads up," he said quietly to Mike. "Some folks don't know when to quit. Document everything, just in case." Mike thanked him, watching as the police cruiser pulled away. The incident had cost them nearly an hour of work, and the sky was beginning to darken with afternoon clouds. "So," Dave said, breaking the uncomfortable silence, "should we keep going or—" Mike looked at the half-dismantled pool, then at Veronica's house where she appeared to be making heated phone calls. "We keep going," he decided firmly. "This is our property, and we're doing nothing wrong." What Mike didn't realize was that Veronica was just getting started, and her next move would involve the entire neighborhood. By Sunday afternoon, Mike and his crew had successfully removed the pool structure. What remained was a circular depression in the yard, a ghostly footprint of the pool's former existence. Mike stood at the edge, already envisioning the raised garden beds Sarah wanted to install. The physical labor had been therapeutic, a welcome distraction from yesterday's confrontation. "Dad, you need to see this," his 16-year-old daughter Emma called from the back door, waving her phone urgently. Mike wiped his hands on his jeans and walked over. "What's up, kiddo?" Emma thrust her phone into his hands. On the screen was a neighborhood Facebook group where Veronica had posted a lengthy diatribe complete with photos taken from her upstairs window showing the pool demolition in progress. Community alert. The Davidsons at 427 Oakwood Lane are destroying neighborhood property values by removing their pool. This selfish act affects all of U.S. Emergency Neighborhood Association meeting TONIJHC at 7 p.m. at the community center to discuss legal options. The post had garnered dozens of comments with opinions seemingly split. Some neighbors expressed support for Mike and Sarah's right to do what they wanted with their property, while others, many of whom Mike barely knew, sided with Veronica, lamenting the loss of neighborhood character. "Great," Mike muttered. "Just great." Sarah appeared at his side, reading over his shoulder. "She can't be serious," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "Oh, she's serious all right," Mike replied, scrolling through the comments. "Look at this. She's claiming our pool was a selling point when she bought her house and that we're liable for damages to her property value." Their 18-year-old son, Josh, joined them, his expression uncharacteristically concerned. "Dad, some of my friends' parents are actually buying into this. The Millers and the Changs both commented that they're going to the meeting tonight." Mike ran a hand through his hair, frustration mounting. "This is ridiculous. It's a private pool that nobody but us has ever used or maintained." "Should we go to the meeting?" Sarah asked quietly. Mike considered this for a moment. Absolutely. I'm not going to hide while someone misrepresents our actions to the entire neighborhood. By 6:45 that evening, the Davidson family arrived at the community center to find the parking lot nearly full, an unprecedented turnout for a neighborhood meeting. As they entered the main hall, conversations hushed momentarily before resuming with increased intensity. Mike noticed several neighbors offering sympathetic smiles, while others averted their gaze or whispered behind cupped hands. Douglas Peterman stood at the front of the room looking distinctly uncomfortable as he arranged papers on a folding table. Veronica sat in the front row, surrounded by a small group of supporters Mike recognized as the neighborhood's most vocal complainers, the same people who policed lawn height with rulers and reported holiday decorations that violated the HOA's strict guidelines. "Let's get this started," Douglas announced once everyone was seated. "We've called this emergency meeting to discuss concerns raised by several residents regarding property modifications at 427 Oakwood Lane." Veronica's hand shot up immediately, but Douglas continued. "Before we open the floor, I want to remind everyone that our HOA bylaws clearly state that homeowners have the right to make changes to their private property as long as those changes comply with our aesthetic guidelines and local building codes." Veronica stood without being acknowledged. "This isn't about aesthetics, Doug. This is about property values." The Davidsons had the only private pool in the neighborhood that was visible from multiple properties. My home valuation specifically mentioned pool views as an amenity. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mike exchanged glances with Sarah, who squeezed his hand reassuringly. "May I respond?" Mike asked, raising his hand. When Douglas nodded, Mike stood and addressed the room. "First, I want to clarify that our pool was never advertised as a neighborhood amenity. It was installed 12 years ago for our family's private use, and in all that time, not once did any neighbor ask to use it." He paused, making eye contact with several longtime residents who nodded in confirmation. "Second, the pool had reached the end of its usable life. The frame was corroding, creating a potential safety hazard. Repairing it would have cost nearly as much as a new installation. Then install a new one." Veronica interrupted. "That's not your decision to make," Sarah replied firmly, standing beside her husband. "We've chosen to use that space for a garden instead." An older resident, Mrs. Abernethy, who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone, raised her hand. "I'd like to say something," she said, her voice carrying surprising strength for her 80 years. "I've watched the Davidson children grow up around that pool. It brought joy to their family for many summers. But times change and families' needs change. When my late husband and I removed our quad pond 15 years ago, no one called the police or organized a witch hunt." Several people chuckled, and Mike felt a surge of gratitude toward the elderly woman. Another neighbor, Raj Patel, stood up. "I work in real estate, and I can tell you definitively that a single private pool, especially an above-ground one, has negligible impact on surrounding property values. If anything, the well-maintained garden that Davidsons are planning could be more appealing to potential buyers." Veronica's supporters began to shift uncomfortably in their seats as the tide of public opinion visibly turned. Douglas, clearly relieved by this development, cleared his throat. "Unless there's evidence of actual HOA violations, which there doesn't appear to be, this matter falls outside our jurisdiction. The Davidsons are within their rights to remove their pool." Veronica jumped to her feet again. "This isn't fair. I've already contacted my attorney. There are laws about removing features that affect adjacent properties." Actually, came a new voice from the back of the room. "There aren't." All heads turned to see a middle-aged man in casual but professional attire. He stepped forward, introducing himself as Richard Torres, another resident who happened to be a property attorney. "I couldn't help overhearing, and I want to clarify something for everyone's benefit. Under state law, homeowners have no obligation to maintain optional recreational features on their private property for the visual benefit of neighbors. The only exception would be if there were specific easements recorded in property deeds, which I seriously doubt is the case here." The meeting erupted into separate conversations, with Veronica's supporters dwindling by the minute. As the formal portion of the meeting dissolved, several neighbors approached Mike and Sarah to offer support and, in some cases, apologies for the unnecessary drama. As the Davidsons prepared to leave, Veronica blocked their path, her voice low but intense. "This isn't over. You made an enemy today." Mike stared at her, suddenly more exhausted than angry. "Veronica, we're neighbors. We should be supporting each other, not fighting over a worn-out pool. If you'd like to discuss this reasonably at some point, our door is always open." Her only response was a scoff as she pushed past them toward the exit. On the drive home, the family processed the evening's events in stunned silence until Emma finally spoke up from the backseat. "So, does this mean we get the garden now?" Sarah laughed, the tension breaking. "Yes, sweetheart. We get the garden. What none of them realized was that while the neighborhood battle might be winding down, Veronica had already set in motion her most dramatic escalation yet. The next week passed in relative calm. Mike filled in the depression left by the pool, and Sarah began marking out her garden design with stakes and string. The kids even showed surprising interest in the project, with Josh researching irrigation systems and Emma sketching plans for a small herbs section of her own. On Friday afternoon, Mike arrived home from work to find an official-looking envelope in the mailbox. Inside was a letter from a law firm representing Winters Property Holdings, LLC, Veronica's name professionally disguised but unmistakable. "You've got to be kidding me," Mike muttered, scanning the document with growing disbelief. The letter alleged that the Davidsons had knowingly and maliciously removed a water feature that constituted an attractive element visible from the Winters property, resulting in significant damages including but not limited to diminished property value, loss of aesthetic enjoyment, and emotional distress. It demanded compensation of $20,000 or the immediate restoration of an equivalent or superior water feature. When Sarah arrived home from her nursing shift at the hospital, Mike wordlessly handed her the letter. Her expression shifted from confusion to incredulity as she read. "This is absurd," she finally said. "She can't possibly think this will hold up in court." "I don't think she cares if it holds up," Mike replied, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "I think she wants to scare us enough that we'll cave." They called Richard Torres, the property attorney from the neighborhood meeting, who agreed to review the letter as a professional courtesy. His assessment, delivered over speakerphone that evening, was blunt. "This is what we call a nuisance claim," he explained. "It has virtually no legal merit, but it's designed to be annoying and expensive enough to fight that most people just settle." "So what should we do?" Sarah asked. "You have two options," Richard replied. "You can ignore it, which might lead to an actual lawsuit that would likely be dismissed but would cost you time and stress. Or you can have an attorney. I'd be happy to help," and a strongly worded response making it clear you won't be intimidated. After discussing it, Mike and Sarah decided on the second option. Richard drafted a response that professionally but firmly outlined the legal baselessness of Veronica's claims and hinted at a potential countersuit for harassment if she persisted. The weekend passed without incident, and by Tuesday, the Davidsons had begun to hope the matter was resolved. Mike had taken a day off to start preparing the soil for Sarah's garden, and the physical labor felt good, constructive, and forward-looking after all the neighborhood drama. He was so absorbed in his work that he almost didn't notice the white van that pulled up in front of their house. It wasn't until he heard the metallic clank of equipment being unloaded that he looked up to see three men in uniforms standing in his driveway. "Can I help you?" Mike called, setting down his shovel and approaching them. "Davidson residents?" asked the oldest of the three, consulting a clipboard. "That's right," Mike confirmed, a sense of unease growing. "We're here to install the pool," the man replied matter-of-factly. Mike stared at him. There must be some mistake. "We didn't order a pool installation." The worker checked his paperwork again. "Order placed by Winters Property Holdings, LLC for installation at 427 Oakwood Lane. Full payment received. Is this not 427 Oakwood?" The realization of what was happening hit Mike like a physical blow. "This is 427 Oakwood. But I didn't authorize any pool installation on my property," he said firmly. "And neither did my wife." The worker frowned, clearly confused. "Sir, we have a signed work order and payment. Is there someone else who might have authorized this? A property manager, perhaps?" "No," Mike replied, fighting to keep his voice level. "This is private property owned by my wife and me. Winters is our neighbor who apparently thinks she can force us to reinstall a pool we removed from our own backyard." Understanding dawned on the worker's face, followed by visible discomfort. "I see. This is unusual. Let me call the office." While the worker stepped away to make his call, Mike pulled out his phone and dialed Richard Torres, quickly explaining the situation. "This is unbelievable," Richard responded. "She's trespassing by proxy. Don't let them do anything, not one shovel of dirt. I'm calling the police non-emergency line right now." By this time, Sarah had arrived home early from her shift, alerted by a text from Mike. She stood beside him, arms crossed, as the pool company workers awkwardly waited for guidance from their office. "The owner says we need to verify property ownership before proceeding," the lead worker finally announced. "Do you have deed documentation readily available?" "We certainly do," Sarah replied crisply, heading inside to retrieve the same folder they'd shown Officer Reyes. As this exchange was occurring, Veronica Sedan pulled up across the street. She remained in her car, watching the scene unfold with an expression that mixed smugness with anticipation. Within 20 minutes, a police cruiser arrived, the same Officer Reyes who had responded to Veronica's first call. He looked considerably less surprised this time, nodding to Mike and Sarah as he approached. "Mr. and Mrs. Davidson, seems we're having another property dispute." Mike explained the situation while the pool company workers stood by, increasingly uncomfortable as they realized they'd been dragged into a neighborhood feud. Officer Reyes reviewed the work order and shook his head. "This is fraudulent. Ms. Winters has no authority to commission work on your property." He turned to the workers. "I recommend you contact your supervisor and explain that you won't be completing this job." The lead worker nodded, relieved to have an official determination. "We'll refund the deposit and be on our way." As the workers began packing up their equipment, Officer Reyes approached Veronica's car. Though Mike couldn't hear their conversation, the officer's body language suggested he was delivering a stern warning. Veronica's animated gestures indicated she was not taking it well. When Officer Reyes returned, his expression was grim. "Mr. and Mrs. Davidson, I strongly recommend you document these incidents and consider filing for a no-contact order if this continues. This is bordering on criminal harassment." After everyone had departed, the pool company with apologies, Officer Reyes with assurances he'd file a detailed report, and Veronica, with a screech of tires, Mike and Sarah sat on their back porch, looking out at the half-prepared garden plot. "Do you think it's over?" Sarah asked softly. Mike shook his head. "No. Whatever's driving her, it's not rational. And people who aren't being rational don't just stop because they're told to." Sarah leaned against his shoulder. "What do we do?" "We guard," and Mike replied simply. "We live our lives, and we prepare for whatever comes next." As if on cue, both their phones chimed with notification sounds. They looked down to see a new post in the neighborhood Facebook group, this one from Veronica. "Breaking news. The Davidsons ASATLTD pool company workers and call the police again. When will someone stop these dangerous neighbors? Community meeting tomorrow to discuss next steps." Sarah groaned. "Here we go again." Mike put his arm around her shoulders. "You'll be okay. The truth is on our side." What they didn't know was that Veronica's escalating behavior had caught the attention of more than just their immediate neighbors, and that the next day would bring a completely unexpected resolution to their problem. Mike opened it to find Douglas Peterman and Richard Torres standing on his porch, both looking surprisingly relaxed given the circumstances. "Morning, Mike," Douglas greeted him. "Got a minute? We have some information you might find interesting." Curious, Mike invited them in. Sarah joined them in the living room, offering coffee, which both men gratefully accepted. "So Richard began, after yesterday's incident, I did some digging into Winters Property Holdings LC. He pulled out a folder and laid several documents on the coffee table. It turns out our neighbor Veronica has quite history." "What kind of history?" Sarah asked, leaned forward. "She's done this before," Douglas said flatly. 3 different neighborhoods in the last 5 years. She moves in, identifies some feature of a neighboring property she likes, then begins a campaign of harassment when the owners don't accommodate her preferences." Mike's eyebrows shot up. "Are you serious?" Richard nodded. In her previous neighborhood, it was a children's treehouse that she claimed was an eyesore, but her kids supposedly loved viewing. Before that, it was a vintage car her neighbor kept in his driveway that she alternately claimed was decreasing property values and should be kept accessible to the community. "The pattern is always the same," Douglas continued. "First complaints to the HOA, then calls to authorities, followed by a legal threat, and finally, some outrageous escalation that usually results in her being asked to leave the neighborhood." Sarah shook her head in disbelief. "But why? What does she get out of this?" "That's the most interesting part," Richard replied. "After reviewing court records from her previous disputes, I discovered she's actually settled several times, always confidentially. She's essentially running a nuisance claim racket, wearing people down until they pay her to stop." Mike let out a low whistle. "So this was never about the pool. It could have been anything about our property she decided to fixate on." "Exactly," Douglas confirmed. "And here's where it gets better. Her post about today's emergency meeting? The community center has no record of any booking. When neighbors started calling me to confirm the time, I realized she was trying to circumvent proper channels." "So what happens now?" Sarah asked. Richard smiled. "That's why we're here. The HOA board held an emergency session last night after reviewing the evidence. They voted unanimously to send Veronica a cease and desist letter regarding her harassment of your family, with the explicit warning that any further incidents will result in fines and potential legal action from the association itself. We've also taken the liberty of speaking with several of her previous neighbors," Douglas added. "They've agreed to provide statements about their experiences, which should be helpful if you need to pursue a restraining order." For the first time in weeks, Mike felt the tension in his shoulders begin to release. "I don't know what to say. Thank you both." "Don't thank us yet," Richard cautioned. "Based on her history, there's a good chance she'll escalate one more time before backing down." As if on cue, the sound of a car door slamming drew their attention to the window. Outside, Veronica was marching up the Davidsons' driveway with a professional-looking woman in a suit beside her. That's our attorney, Richard said, recognizing the other woman. Interesting timing. Mike sighed. Should we? Allow me, Richard offered, standing up. As a concerned neighbor, I'd be happy to join this conversation. The doorbell rang and Mike answered it with Richard, Douglas, and Sarah standing supportively behind him. Mr. Davidson, the attorney began formally. I'm Jennifer Rees representing Ms. Winters. We're here to discuss. Hello, Jennifer, Richard cut in smoothly. Richard Torres, property attorney. I don't believe we met formally, though I'm familiar with your work in Cayman Heights and Riverside Gardens with Ms. Winters here. The attorney's professional demeanor faltered momentarily. Mr. Torres, I wasn't aware the Davidsons had retained counsel. Oh, I'm just a concerned neighbor, Richard replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. But I am fascinated by the pattern of behavior your client has established across multiple communities. 3 neighborhoods in 5 years, each with nearly identical complaints and escalations. That's quite a coincidence. Veronica's face drained of color. That's not relevant, too. Actually, Douglas interjected, as AHOA president, I find it extremely relevant, especially the confidential settlements your client has previously secured through what some might characterize as persistent harassment. The attorney glanced at Veronica with poorly concealed surprise. Ms. Winters, you assured me this was an isolated property dispute. Mike, sensing an opportunity, stepped forward. Ms. Reeves, we have documentation of multiple incidents, including your client fraudulently ordering construction work on our property yesterday. The responding officer recommended we pursue a no-contact order, which I'd be happy to help them file, Richard added pleasantly, along with a counterclaim for intentional infliction of emotional distress, fraudulent misrepresentation, and defamation based on your client's social media posts falsely accusing the Davidsons of assault. The attorney's professional composure crumbled entirely as she turned to Veronica. We need to speak privately, now. As they retreated to confer by Veronica's car, the Davidsons exchanged glances with Richard and Douglas. Is that it? Sarah whispered. Will they just leave? Not quite yet, Richard murmured. Watch. After a heated discussion that included visible gesturing from the attorney, the women returned to the porch. The attorney looked resigned while Veronica appeared furious but contained. My client would like to offer an apology for any misunderstanding, the attorney stated mechanically. She will be withdrawing her complaints and will not pursue any further action regarding your property decisions. And, Richard prompted. The attorney sighed, and she agrees to refrain from any direct or indirect contact with the Davidson family, including social media posts referencing them or their property. Mike nodded. That would be acceptable, provided it's put in writing. I'll have the agreement drafted by Monday, the attorney replied, already turning to leave. Veronica remained just long enough to shoot one last venomous glare at the assembled neighbors before following her attorney to the car. As they drove away, Mike turned to Richard. Is that really it? Richard smiled. Based on her pattern, once legally cornered, she typically moves on to a new neighborhood within 60 days. She's a bully, and bullies don't like being confronted with their own tactics. By Sunday afternoon, word had spread throughout the neighborhood about Veronica's history and the resolution of the pool dispute. As Mike and Sarah worked in their emerging garden, they were surprised by a steady stream of neighbors stopping by, some bringing plants as gifts, others offering to help with the heavy digging, many simply wanting to express support. Mrs. Abernathy arrived with a flat of heirloom tomato seedlings and a knowing smile. Gardens are much better than pools anyway, she declared. They give back to the community in ways a pool never could. As the sun began to set, the Davidsons sat on their patio surveying the progress. What had started as a simple decision to remove an unused pool had transformed into something unexpected. A stronger connection with their neighbors and a reaffirmation of their community values.